question is as on the order paper. I call the Minister, Mr John Penrose.
Mr Speaker, I'm delighted to respond to this important debate organised by the Democratic Unionist Party, and I should start by commending their long-standing support for the principle of holding a referendum on the EU. As the honourable gentleman from Belfast North has mentioned, they were there earlier than many, and I think their consistency and constancy in this particular point of principle is a model to many. Although, before we get too far into it, Mr Speaker, I think it's important for us all to remember that any debate about the referendum date needs to be undertaken in the conditional tense. In other words, to make a statement of the blindingly obvious, the date for the referendum is not yet set. As the Prime Minister has been consistent in saying, it's renegotiation and then referendum. The renegotiation is not yet complete, and so there is no referendum date as yet either.
Given that, and given the range, the broad party, devolved nation range of interests asking for the referendum not to be held in June, given that no date has been set, why is the government so reluctant not to accede to the views of the right honourable gentleman?
Well, Mr Speaker, I'm about to come on to the point, but I think it would be, at the very least, disrespectful to the principle behind the Referendum Act, which says that the date for the referendum has to be set through a debate on the affirmative resolution in this House through a statutory instrument in due course. So when that point comes, there will be plenty of opportunity to debate this, and I think it would be premature to start ruling in or out too many dates, although I will come on to those dates we have already ruled out for the honourable gentleman's benefit, just to remind the whole House, if I can. I will, and then I really must make some progress, but happy to give way to my other.
I'm very grateful, especially so early in his remarks. But following on from that, we appreciate we're not talking about a specific date proposed by the government for the referendum. We're talking about the principle of having certain dates. And I wonder if, therefore, if you would comment on the appropriateness of holding the referendum on the same date as a European Council meeting.
Well, Mr Speaker, I appreciate that my honourable friend is an assiduous follower of matters European. I suspect he may be one of the very few people in the entire country who pays that much attention to the musings of the European Council. But I think they might be honoured to feel that their conclusions had as much weight with anybody else as they clearly do with him. But I plan to come on and address some of the broader issues around perhaps underlying his question in a second, if I can. Now, I say that because the renegotiation is not yet complete and we don't have a date for the referendum yet set, I say this because I suspect that some colleagues may try, gently and kindly I am sure, to tempt me into some hideous indiscretion in revealing a planned referendum date, whether in June or in any other month between now and the end of 2017, when the referendum might be held. And for the sake of our collective mental and emotional health, as well as having to save us an awful lot of time, I thought I should take this opportunity to advise any amateur criminologists hoping to glean clues about the date of the referendum from close textual analysis of my remarks not to bother. There aren't any clues. Happily.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm wondering if the Minister will answer me this very simple question then, notwithstanding what he said. Does he agree with the points that were raised in the letter by the three First Ministers?
Mr Speaker, I'm going to come on to address those points in a second, so I'm sure the honourable gentleman will pick me up if he feels that I've glossed over any inappropriately. But I would just repeat, there aren't any clues. To quote Alan Greenspan, the famously gnomic and opaque former chairman of the US Federal Reserve, I guess I should warn you, if I turn out to be particularly clear, you've probably misunderstood what I meant. And he then went on to say, I know you think you understand what you thought I said, but I'm not sure you realise that what you heard is not what I meant. In other words, Mr Speaker, clues, please, are to be avoided. But even if we don't yet know the precise date when the referendum will be held, we know several dates when it definitely won't. It won't be May the 5th, 2016, or the 4th of May 2017. Both these dates are expressly excluded in the primary legislation we passed last year. It also won't be within 6 weeks of the 5th of May this year either, as recently promised by my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister. And these exclusions are important, Mr Speaker, even if we don't yet know the exact date of the referendum, because they create and guarantee enough space and time between any other upcoming elections and the referendum to make sure the important issues in each set of polls are debated fully and separately in each case. I'll happily give it.
Grateful to the Minister for giving me, Mr. Speaker. The Referendum Act specifies a 10-week period between the Government publishing its response to the negotiations and the referendum date, presumably because this House and another place thought 10 weeks was a length of time people needed to digest that information. Would it not then be wrong for 3 of those 10 weeks to happen right in the middle of an election campaign that affects 20 million plus citizens who will also be voting in the referendum a few weeks later?
Mr. Speaker, I'm just about to come on to that point, so again, I hope I can answer that if I can, but if not, I'm sure the honourable gentleman will come back to me. And it matters, this idea of separately debating and fully debating, because May the 5th this year will be a very busy time at the ballot box, as we've just heard. We have, to mention only a few, votes for the Mayor of London, for police and crime commissioners, and for devolved legislatures in Stormont, Cardiff and Edinburgh. So I'm not arguing, as some do, that it is impossible to hold more than one election in the same place on the same day. Last May's general election, which saw local council elections take place in the same time in many parts of the country without democracy collapsing in a heap, shows that voters and election administrators are perfectly capable of handling such a situation comfortably. In fact, my honourable friend from Dorset said that everyone is capable of walking and chewing gum at the same time, and I think the honourable gentleman from Belfast North was very, very clear that that is not the main source of his concern. I'll happily give way.
Mr. Gregory Campbell.
Thank you, Mr. for giving way. While accepting what he says, would he agree with me that the difference here is that the referendum will absorb the minds and hearts of people throughout the United Kingdom like it hasn't done for 40 years, and that we must do that unencumbered with any other electoral consideration at the same time?
Yes. Mr. Speaker, I would agree with part of that point. The point is that it's the overlap needs to be dealt with very, very carefully, I think, and we need to make sure that we aren't trying to run two things at the same time, because it is perfectly feasible to have an overlap, providing you accept that you have a 6-week gap as a minimum between two polls. I would remind the House, Mr. Speaker, that a 6-week gap is the full length of a general election campaign. We decide the government of this country on the basis of a 6-week campaign. And that is, I think, a very, very good example of why it is perfectly feasible to make such happen.
I'm sorry to tell the Minister, but after those 6 weeks of a general election campaign, my constituents are pretty cheesed off with politics. And, I think we need to understand that actually not everybody in the country is as excited about politics as we are in this place. And actually you need a short campaign where people can focus on the issues and make a decision at the end of that short campaign.
Well, absolutely, Mr. Speaker. It is one of those, Europe is one of those issues which may be extremely exciting to a small number of people, may be extremely exciting to a small number of people in this place and in the sort of half mile around us. But if we bang on about Europe, to use a phrase, for far too long, then I think we run a countervailing risk, which is to start turning people off the idea of this whole issue, important though it is. And having a decent period of time, one which, after all, we use to decide general elections, is something which the country is used to, is something which the electorate is used to. It gives plenty of time for a full and in-depth discussion of the issues that need to be covered, but without necessarily boring everybody to tears and turning everybody off by the time we get to the ballot box. Now, we do have to have a gap, I completely accept, but that is the point. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady and then to the Honourable Gentleman after that.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very grateful indeed to the Minister for allowing me to intervene. Since, of course, Northern Ireland remains a part of the United Kingdom and will do for a very long period to come, I expect that the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom will come to campaign in Northern Ireland to remain within the EU. I think it would be very helpful to this debate if, in fact, the Minister could confirm that the Prime Minister will indeed come to campaign within Northern Ireland, but will do so after the Northern Ireland Assembly elections, not before.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank the Honourable Lady for giving me the opportunity to commit the Prime Minister's forward diary in such a specific way. I think probably that would be a career-limiting move were I to do so, but I suspect that she will make her point very, very strongly, and he will have an opportunity to respond to that point very specifically. I was going to give way to the Honourable Gentleman, and then I must make some progress if I can.
Length of time. I'm sure the Minister would agree that the decision on remaining in the European Union is at least as important as the decision that Scotland had to take on remaining or leaving the United Kingdom. And there were 540 days between the announcement of the date and the date of the poll. Now, we're not necessarily suggesting there has to be that length of time, but surely, if you're saying there needs to be a free and open discussion, it should be longer than potentially 6 weeks.
Mr. Speaker, that's where I would respectfully, I think, part company with the honourable gentleman. I think while it would be stretching a point to argue that holding two polls in the same place, a minimum of 6 weeks apart, will be somehow disrespectful or prejudice the results of either one. Can I just finish this point and then I will, because otherwise it won't make it. So it's important, I believe, to provide enough time for the issues and arguments to be debated fully. But because a 6-week minimum, which is the length of an entire general election campaign after all, will provide plenty of time for an extremely full and detailed democratic debate to take place, and I'll happily give.
The Chairman of the European Scrutiny Committee is seeking to fox the Chamber. I won't say the honourable gentleman has perambulated around the Chamber, but he has entered most uncharacteristically from a different door and is seated differently. There's nothing disorderly, but it is mildly confusing, and I hope that he might perambulate towards his normal position in due course, because we'll all feel so much more comfortable. Sir William Cash.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. I love that. Would the Minister be kind enough to tell us, with respect to the date, which the final date being the 31st of December 2017, that it would be a slam dunk that we would not have the referendum during the French presidential elections of April and May 2017, nor the German federal elections of the 22nd September 2017 as well?
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I firstly congratulate my honourable friend for sitting in a different place to demonstrate flexibility of mind and a different approach just every once in a while to keep us on our toes. I have to confess, though, that on the specifics of his question, that is not something which has been factored into any of my discussions so far on potential dates at all. Perhaps they should be, and I will take that away if I possibly can. Mr. Speaker, the motion also notes the recommendations of the Electoral Commission on best practice for referendums. The Electoral Commission has produced reports on previous referendums, and we've taken on board many of its recommendations, although not all, in the EU Referendum Act, such as pre-poll reporting of donations and loans. And we also take on board its views in other areas. For example, we followed their recommendations to change the wording of the referendum question. And we also consulted them on the draft conduct regulations, which set out the detailed framework for the administration of the referendum poll. These are only a few examples of when we've been listening to their thoughts.
I'm slightly puzzled as to why the Minister is praying in aid that the Government ruled out May the 5th, the same date as the elections in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and London. My certain memory of that process last year during the legislation is the Government only did that unwillingly when we were facing certain defeat on the legislation. So why is he now praying this is a great government concession?
Actually, Mr. Speaker, I'm just referring back to my notes, but I don't think that I said that we did anything. I said both these dates are expressly excluded in the primary legislation we passed last year. We passed, this Parliament passed, Mr. Speaker, and I will leave it to criminologists and others to decide whether or not that was done under pressure, with grace, or anything else. But nonetheless, the will of Parliament was decided, was expressed, and was listened to extremely carefully. I hope the right honourable gentleman would agree. My honourable friend.
I'm most grateful to my honourable friend, and he will know, as chairman of the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee, we are taking an interest in this matter of the date, and I also declare my interest as a director of Vote Leave, one of the potentially designated campaigns. But can I press him on the assurance that he gave the House in September last year, when he said, and I quote, "It is important that the designation process means that the decision on who are the lead campaign groups for the in and out campaigns is properly arrived at, and those groups are clearly designated before the start of the 10-week campaign." Does he stand by that assurance, or is this going to be fudged?
Mr. Speaker, I remember that moment very, very clearly. In fact, I think I was responding to a question from my right honourable friend, the member for Stone, in making that point. And what I was trying to put across there was I had what I thought was a brilliant solution to the potential problem of any compressed timetable, should there be one, in order to find time enough for both designation and the full referendum timescale. And the original point I was making at that point in our discussions, I think it was during committee stage, but I could be wrong, was that we could have dealt with the designation process through a negative SI, which would be made when it's laid, and therefore would allow the designation process to start early and therefore to finish before the beginning of the referendum period, which I think is what everybody was driving at the time. The equivalent, Mr. Speaker, of the Joint Committee on Statutory Instruments in the Lords felt that a negative as a statutory instrument was inappropriate. They said it should be a positive statutory instrument, which has made my task rather more difficult, as he would appreciate, in achieving what we were all discussing at that point. I will take, if I can, his earnest point and his strongly made point, both to me and earlier to the Honourable Member for North Belfast, as a very strong preference for starting designation as early as possible, should there be any compressed timetable which we had to work through. To start designation as early as possible, and I'm sure that the various different campaigns are already working on their designation submissions, if I can just finish my point, and that therefore, were it to be necessary, he would aim for a shorter, a very, very efficient designation process in order to avoid an overlap between designation at the end and the start of the referendum process. Does he want to come back on that as to make sure I've understood him correctly?
I'm most grateful to him and for that explanation. But unless the government put on record before the House agreed to that affirmative resolution procedure that the consequence of agreeing the affirmative resolution procedure might be that the designated campaigns might not be designated until the referendum campaigns have already started, I think he is bound by his commitment. And therefore, if there is going to be a referendum on the 23rd of June, which seems to be the possibility, either the regulations must be expedited in order to foreshorten the period in which that we can start the designation earlier, or he must put back the date. I'm as keen as anybody to get on with this referendum, but not on the basis of undesignated campaigns trying to start the campaign without the necessary resources and without the necessary authority, and without being able to plan what they're going to do.
Mr. Speaker, it's very, very helpful for him to remind me of my point, and I guess the point I would make is this. We are all subject to the will of Parliament, and therefore, if the Lords, in this case, in their wisdom, decided to change the process which I was laying out at that point, then it's very, very difficult for me to be bound by anything other than the later expressed will of Parliament. However, I do appreciate the point that he is making, that it would be a superior outcome if we possibly can to avoid any overlap between the two. I think he is saying to me that he would prefer to see a rapid process for designation and to start it as promptly and efficiently as possible, should that be necessary. And I will make sure that I take that point back, strongly expressed as it is, and that we strain every sinew to accommodate him if we can. Mr. Speaker, I will, because I'm conscious that other people want to get in, I will omit any other comments about the various different points of the Electoral Commission's advice that we have been following or not. But can I just make clear that the process from here forward, Mr. Speaker, is clearly laid out by Parliament in the EU Referendum Act. It requires the Government to bring forward a number of statutory instruments subject to the affirmative process, as we've just been hearing, before a poll can be held. Conduct rules, the detailed plumbing of how the poll will be held, which are already laid before the House, and which I hope are uncontroversial, plus regulations setting the date, the referendum period and the start date of the designation period, as we've just been discussing. These are not yet laid, but when they are, this debate will be able to move at last out of the conditional tense and into action. For the Government will be doing something which has not been, I will happily give way very, very briefly, and then I must finish off my remarks.
Thank the Minister for giving way. And just a point in this compressed time period with the possible date of the 23rd of June. The Scottish schools are about to go on holiday at that point, and many of the electorate will be either planning or starting to take their holidays. The 22nd in some local authorities will be the date. It's unthinkable to have a vote of such importance during English school holidays, yet this vote could actually take place during Scottish school holidays.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to go back to my starting point about being tempted into giving guidance on when the vote for the referendum might be. That is not a matter about which we are able to tell anybody yet, because we do not have a final a completion of the referendum and of the negotiations, and without a completion of the negotiations there can be no referendum. The Prime Minister has been very, very clear on that point. I'm sure that he will notice and note the honourable lady's point nonetheless when he comes to consider that point. But nonetheless, Mr. Speaker, I would point out that the government is going to be doing something which has not been achieved for over a generation, something which I and many others in Parliament and across the entire country have long been denied: a vote, a say, a voice on our relationship with the European Union. And whichever side of that argument we are on, whether we vote to leave or we vote to remain, I hope that as Democrats we will all welcome the dawning of that referendum day.
Order. Just before I call